It's 1970. Inside a Motown recording studio in Detroit. The walls are padded. The air smells like cigarette smoke and fresh reel tape. Somewhere down the hall, one of the greatest musical machines ever assembled is running full tilt. Producers, musicians, arrangers, engineers, all of them professionals, all of them experienced, all of them very, very good at what they do. And then there's an 11-year-old kid in a striped shirt. He's standing on the studio floor, 5 feet from the glass that separates him from the mixing board, and he's just raised his hand. Quiet, calm, like he's in math class. The tape is playing back what was just recorded. His voice, this extraordinary, impossible voice, fills the monitors. The strings are swelling, the arrangement is perfect, the levels are clean. And the kid says, barely above a whisper, "That's not my voice." 3 adults at the mixing board turn and look at him. Now here's what you have to understand. This isn't a prima donna moment. This isn't a child throwing a tantrum. This is a kid who has sung that song so many times, who knows every inflection, every breath, every note, that something in his brain, some internal tuning fork that most human beings simply don't have, is telling him that what he's hearing and what he sang are 2 different things. And he's right. He just doesn't know yet that he's about to prove it to a room full of adults who have been doing this since before he was born. That moment, that one raised hand, is what we're talking about today. Because it wasn't just the moment the engineers realized the tape machine was miscalibrated. It was the moment Motown realized they weren't just working with a talented kid. They were working with something they'd never seen before. If you're new here, welcome. We cover music history, the stories behind the songs, and the moments that changed everything. Hit subscribe if that sounds like your kind of thing, because we've got a lot more coming. And stick around, this story gets better with every minute. To really feel the weight of what happened that day in the studio, we need to go back a little further. It's 1969. Gary, Indiana, a steel town, a hard town, not the kind of place that produces pop superstars, except that it did 9 of them, all from the same house on Jackson Street. The Jackson family. Joe Jackson, the father, was a steelworker who played guitar in a band on weekends. He saw his son's talent early and he pushed it hard in ways that would become controversial later in Michael's life. But the talent was real. It wasn't manufactured. These boys could sing, and among them, the youngest performing member of the group, little Michael, was something else entirely. Michael Jerome Jackson was born on August 29, 1958. By the time he was 6 years old, he was performing. By the time he was 8, he was the lead singer of the Jackson 5. By the time he was 10, he was on the Chitlin circuit, performing in clubs that had no business letting a child through the door, watching things a child should not have to watch, learning from musicians who were old and tired and brilliant. He was absorbing everything. Now here's a thing most people don't appreciate about the young Michael Jackson. When we talk about child prodigies, we usually mean someone who's technically impressive. They can play the notes fast, they can hit the high ones. But Michael wasn't just technically impressive. He had a kind of musical intelligence that was almost frightening in how complete it was. He understood music emotionally, spatially, structurally. He could hear a song once and understand not just the melody, but the intention behind it. James Brown was his biggest idol, and you can see it in how he moved, the spins, the footwork, the sudden freezes. But where most kids who idolize James Brown are just imitating the surface, Michael was studying the architecture. Why did Brown stop here? Why did he scream there? Why does the band drop out at that exact moment? What is the silence doing? Michael understood what silence was doing. That's not a thing most adults who work in music understand. Silence isn't the absence of music, it's part of the music. It creates tension, it creates release, it makes the notes that come after it land harder. Michael knew this at 10 years old in the same way that some kids just know how to play chess, not because anyone taught them the strategy, but because the patterns are just visible to them in a way they aren't for most people. So when Motown came calling, they weren't just signing a kid with a good voice. They were signing something they couldn't fully see yet. Let's talk about Motown for a second, because you have to understand what this label was, what it meant, and why the fact that an 11-year-old challenged it matters so much. Motown Records was founded in 1959 by Berry Gordy Jr. in Detroit, Michigan. Gordy started with $800 borrowed from family. Within a decade, he had built the most successful independent record label in American history up to that point, and he'd done it with a level of systematic precision that people in the music industry still talk about today. Motown wasn't just a record label. It was a factory, and I don't mean that in a dismissive way. I mean it in the way that a master craftsman's workshop is a factory. Everything had a process, everything had a standard, everything was quality controlled. Berry Gordy hired artists and signed them, yes, but he also sent them to charm school. He hired a woman named Maxine Powell to teach his artists etiquette, poise, and presentation. He hired Collie Atkins to choreograph their moves. He created a system called the Quality Control Meeting, where every single song that was going to be released was played and critiqued by a panel before it went out the door. The studio itself, the one on West Grand Boulevard in Detroit that became known as Hitsville, USA, was a converted house with a recording studio built into the garage. And that studio was the heart of the whole operation. The musicians who worked there, the legendary Funk Brothers, were some of the most talented session players in the world. They recorded the backbone of so many hits that when you add it all up, historians believe the Funk Brothers played on more #1 records than the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the Beach Boys combined. This was the environment the Jackson 5 walked into. Bobby Taylor, a Motown artist who had caught the Jacksons performing in Chicago, brought them to Berry Gordy's attention. Gordy signed them in 1969, and from the very beginning there was a mutual recognition happening. Motown knew these kids were special, and the kids, especially Michael, were learning from Motown. But here's the thing about any institution, even a brilliant one. Institutions develop confidence. They develop processes. They develop over time a kind of pride in those processes. The equipment at Motown was top shelf. The engineers were professionals. The sessions ran on tight schedules because Berry Gordy didn't tolerate waste. And then a kid in a striped shirt raised his hand. The session was a standard tracking day, the kind Motown ran dozens of times a week. Michael had just laid down a vocal take, a ballad, strings in the arrangement, the kind of song that required genuine emotional commitment, not just technical skill. And he had delivered. Everyone in the room knew it. The engineer said the levels were clean, the tape was fresh. By every measurable standard, they had what they needed. Then they ran the playback. And Michael listened. He always listened. Not just with his ears, with his whole body. Other singers would play back and be checking themselves against what they meant to do. Michael was checking himself against an internal map that was extraordinarily precise. He knew the exact feeling of that high run in the second verse. He knew what his voice had done at the bridge. He knew, note by note, the specific frequencies his body had produced when he stood in front of that microphone. What was coming back at him, through the monitors, did not match that map. It was subtle. We're not talking about something that was obviously wrong, like the tape playing at half speed. We're talking about something in the neighborhood of a half step, maybe less. A small shift in pitch, a slight brightness to the vocal that wasn't there in the actual performance. Most people in the room wouldn't have caught it. Most professional musicians wouldn't have caught it. It was the kind of thing that slips past because everything else sounds fine. But Michael heard it. He raised his hand, calm as anything, and said it wasn't his voice. Now the adults in the room had a decision to make. This is important, because what they were really being asked to decide in that moment was, do we trust the machine or do we trust the kid? The instinct, the professional, reasonable, well-founded instinct, was to trust the machine. The equipment was studio grade. It was maintained and calibrated by professionals. It had been in use all week without issue. The engineer had been doing this job for years. The producer had worked with Marvin Gaye, with Smokey Robinson, with the cream of American soul music. The kid was 11. The producer said politely but firmly that the machine was fine. Michael didn't argue. He didn't get loud. He didn't cry or pout or throw the kind of fit that you might expect from a child being told he was wrong. He just waited, with this extraordinary patience, like he already knew the outcome and was just waiting for the process to catch up. "Check the speed," he said. That's when the room shifted. Because of all the possible problems with a tape machine, tape speed is one of the most technical and least obvious. You don't just hear tape speed variation with untrained ears. You feel it sometimes in the pitch and the texture of the sound. And you need equipment to confirm it, specifically a strobe disc, a calibration tool that measures whether the machine's playback speed matches a reference standard by observing whether a rotating pattern appears to stand still or drift under a specific light. The engineer went to check, and this is the moment, this is the thing. The strobe disc marks blurred, adjusted, blurred again. The tape machine was running approximately 3 to 4% too fast. 3 to 4%. That doesn't sound like much. But in musical terms, 3 to 4% speed variance is enough to sharpen a pitch by almost a quarter step. It's enough to change the timbre of a voice, to make it slightly brighter, slightly thinner, slightly more strained in the upper register than it actually was. It's enough to make a recording sound like the singer, just not quite like the singer. Michael heard it, Michael named it, Michael was right. The pen fell off the legal pad, and nobody picked it up. I want to sit with the silence in that room for a second, because I think it's worth it. There's a particular kind of silence that happens when an adult realizes a child was right about something the adult was confident about. It's uncomfortable. It's a little humbling. It requires a small internal recalibration of your model of the world, of who knows things, of where expertise lives, of what you were so sure of 5 minutes ago. That silence filled the Motown studio. The assistant engineer's smirk was gone. The head engineer set the strobe disc down slowly. The producer stared through the glass at this 11-year-old kid who was just standing there, not triumphant, not smug, just ready for the next thing. The engineer fixed the machine. He adjusted the speed trim pot, a small control on the side of the tape deck that is, under normal circumstances, almost never touched. He ran the strobe test again. This time the marks held still. They played the tape. The strings came back, the voice came back, and this time, same performance, same words, same phrasing, it sat right. It sounded like Michael. It sounded the way the producer had heard it when the kid was standing in front of the microphone, singing it live. "How did you know?" the producer asked. Michael shrugged. "I just heard it." Now, here's what's fascinating about that answer, because it sounds like a simple, modest thing to say. But it actually describes something genuinely extraordinary. To just hear something like that, to carry such a precise internal model of your own voice that a 3% change in playback speed registers as wrong, requires a combination of things that almost never appear together in one person. First, it requires perfect pitch, or something very close to it. The technical term is absolute pitch, the ability to identify or reproduce a musical note without a reference tone. Most musicians work in relative pitch, meaning they can identify that this note is a fifth above that note. People with absolute pitch know the note itself. It's not learned. You either have it or you don't. And the current estimate is that it occurs in roughly 1 in 10,000 people in Western countries, though it may be more common in populations that grow up with tonal languages. Second, it requires extraordinary timbral sensitivity, the ability to hear not just pitch but the texture, the color, the quality of a sound. Two singers can sing the same note at the same volume, and the sounds will be completely different because of how they produce it. Timbral sensitivity is what lets you recognize a friend's voice on the phone in the first second, before they've even said a word. Michael had it to a degree that was, by all accounts, essentially unprecedented. Third, and maybe most importantly, it requires an internal map, a kind of sonic memory. Michael had sung that song. His brain had recorded not just what the song sounded like, but what it felt like to sing it, what frequencies resonated in his chest, what his voice did in his own body. And when the playback deviated from that map, the mismatch registered like an alarm. Most of us don't have that. Most of us listen to ourselves sing, and our internal model is fuzzy enough that we accept a lot of variation. Michael's model was precise. It was almost laboratory precise. "I just heard it." 3 words, and behind them, one of the most extraordinary instruments for sound ever housed in a human being. The word prodigy gets thrown around a lot. It gets attached to any kid who can play Beethoven at 6 or solve algebra at 7. And there are genuinely remarkable child prodigies in every field: music, chess, mathematics, languages. But most prodigies are impressive in the way that a very powerful calculator is impressive. They can process and reproduce faster than normal, but they're working within understood parameters. What made Michael Jackson different wasn't just that he could perform at an adult level. Lots of child performers could do that. What made him different was that he could perceive at an adult level, no, not even an adult level. He could perceive at a level that most adults in his professional orbit had never demonstrated. Think about what his producers and engineers had seen before Michael. They had worked with Marvin Gaye, who had one of the most emotionally intelligent voices in the history of American music. They had worked with Smokey Robinson, who was a brilliant songwriter and a refined performer. They had worked with Diana Ross, with The Temptations, with Stevie Wonder, who, incidentally, is one of the other musicians in history who clearly had absolute pitch. These were not ordinary talents. These were giants of American music, and the engineers who worked with them were good enough to keep up with those giants. Michael came in and caught something none of them had caught. That's the thing, the head engineer hadn't heard the speed variance. The producer hadn't heard it. The assistant engineer hadn't heard it, and these weren't inexperienced people. These were exactly the right people to hear something like that, and they missed it. What does it mean when an 11-year-old hears something the professionals miss? It means you're not dealing with a talented kid who's ahead of his age. You're dealing with a qualitatively different kind of listener, a different kind of musician, someone whose relationship to sound operates on a different set of parameters. The producer circled the words absolute pitch twice on his legal pad that day and underlined them. He understood even in that moment that he was in the presence of something that didn't come along often, maybe ever. And the engineers, these veterans who had been calibrating machines and mixing albums for years, went back and double-checked everything after that session. Not because Michael had embarrassed them, but because they now knew there was someone in the room who could catch what they missed, and that changes how you work. Here's the part of the story that people don't always talk about. It's not just about one session, one tape machine, one raised hand. What happened that day in the Motown studio changed the dynamic of every session after it. And understanding that ripple effect is how you understand how Michael Jackson went from talented child performer to, within just a few years, someone who was actively shaping the records he was on. In the immediate aftermath, the head engineer started doing something he had never bothered with before. He double-checked the tape speed before every session. Not because he was told to, because he'd been shown once that his assumption of correctness wasn't good enough. That's a professional recalibration, a craftsman deciding to raise his own standards because someone else demonstrated a higher bar. The assistant engineer started asking Michael's opinion on microphone placement. Does this sound boxy to you? Consulting an 11-year-old on mic placement would have been unthinkable before that day. After it, it was just common sense. If the kid can hear a 3% tape speed variance, he can tell you whether the microphone is picking up room noise. And Michael, characteristically, answered straight. He'd listen. He'd nod or tilt his head. And then he'd say something that was usually right, not always, but usually, enough that people started treating his input as signal rather than noise. By the time Michael was 12, he was sitting in on mixing sessions. That's not standard. Kids don't sit in on mixing sessions. They record their parts and they go home. Michael stayed. He watched. He asked questions. He absorbed the technical side of record making the way he absorbed everything else, completely with intense focus and with a kind of pleasure in the complexity of it. By 13, he was suggesting arrangement changes. By 15, he was co-producing, though that credit wasn't always formalized on the record. And by the time Michael Jackson made Off the Wall in 1979 and Thriller in 1982, that kid who'd raised his hand in the Motown studio was one of the most hands-on, technically engaged recording artists in the world. He knew what he wanted. He knew how to ask for it in technical language. He understood the tools well enough to push the people using them. Quincy Jones, who produced Off the Wall, Thriller, and Bad, often spoke about what it was like to work with Michael in the studio. Quincy is himself one of the most musically sophisticated people who has ever lived, a man who spent decades as a trumpet player, arranger, and producer, working in jazz, pop, film, television, you name it. And Quincy said that Michael heard things he hadn't heard. That Michael could listen to a rough mix and identify something specific and small that was pulling against the groove. That Michael would sing a part he was hearing in his head, a high harmony or a background vocal or an atmospheric element, and it would be exactly right. This is a direct line from that day in 1970. A kid who caught a 3% tape speed variance became a man who reshaped pop music by hearing things that highly educated, deeply experienced adults couldn't hear. Let's dig into the science for a second, because I think it's genuinely interesting and it helps explain what Michael could do. Absolute pitch, sometimes called perfect pitch, is the ability to identify or produce a musical note without any external reference. You play a note on a piano and most musicians can tell you what note it is relative to other notes. But a person with absolute pitch can tell you the note itself. They can hear a car horn and say, "That's an E-flat." They can hear a baby cry and identify the pitch. They can sing a C-sharp on demand without a piano in the room. About 1 in 10,000 people have it, in populations that don't grow up speaking tonal languages. It's more common in people who began musical training before age 7. There seems to be a developmental window. But it's not just about training. The vast majority of people who start music lessons young don't develop it. It appears to have a significant genetic component. Here's the fascinating thing about absolute pitch in terms of Michael's situation that day. The kind of detection Michael demonstrated is actually even rarer than simple note identification. What Michael did wasn't just identify a pitch. He identified that a pitch had been altered from what it should be in playback across a complex musical arrangement, with string instruments and other vocal elements filling the sonic space. That's not just absolute pitch. That's absolute pitch with a layer of extraordinary working memory for pitch. The ability to hold in his mind the exact sound of his own voice singing that song in that take at that moment, and then compare it to the playback and notice the discrepancy. Neurologists who have studied absolute pitch note that it appears to be associated with a different kind of auditory cortex development. The part of the brain that processes sound shows structural differences in people who have it. It's not just a skill, it's a hardware difference. And in Michael's case, it was combined with the kind of timbral sensitivity to the tone, color, and texture of sounds, that is separate from absolute pitch and equally rare. He wasn't just hearing a pitch difference. He was hearing a quality of sound difference. The fact that the speed variance altered not just the pitch but the timbre of his voice, making it slightly thinner and brighter than his actual recorded voice, and that he noticed both, that's staggering. A music researcher who later analyzed the Motown recordings from this era noted that a 3 to 4% speed increase would produce approximately a 50-cent shift in pitch, roughly a quarter step, as well as a perceptible brightening of the higher harmonics in the vocal. In other words, it would make the voice sound younger and thinner than it actually was. Michael heard both the pitch shift and the timbral change and identified them as wrong. He was 11 years old. One of the details that makes this story so compelling is that the producer kept notes from that session. A manila folder, marked with the Jackson 5's early Motown designation, containing legal pad pages with session logs, running times, arrangement notes, and right there on one of the pages, the words absolute pitch circled twice, underlined. Those notes survived. And years later, when a music journalist was doing a retrospective on Motown's golden era and asked the producer what he remembered most about working with young Michael Jackson, the producer didn't talk about the performances. He didn't talk about the hit records. He talked about that day, that session, that tape machine. He said, "That's when I knew, not that he'd be famous. Famous is timing and luck. I knew he'd be great, because great is knowing the tape speed's wrong when nobody else in the room can hear it. Fame is about the audience. Greatness is about the work." That distinction matters, because Michael Jackson was, throughout his career, relentlessly about the work. He was famous in a way that very few human beings in history have been. At his peak, his fame was a thing unto itself, a force of nature. But the fame was always almost beside the point for him. What he cared about was the sound, the record, the performance. He wasn't standing at that glass thinking about how he'd look when the album came out. He wasn't thinking about the review, the chart position, the tour. He was thinking about the fact that the second verse vocal didn't sound right and something was causing that, and they needed to find it and fix it. He was 11. There's something both inspiring and a little heartbreaking about that level of dedication in a child. Inspiring because it's the purest form of artistic commitment, caring about the work because the work matters, not because of what the work will bring you. Heartbreaking because it means that the normal childhood things, playing, pretending, letting things be good enough, were never quite available to him the way they are to most kids. He swung his legs on the stool while waiting for his father to pick him up, and his feet didn't touch the floor. That image is real, and it sits right next to the image of this same kid stopping a Motown session because he could hear the tape running 3% too fast. Both things were true at the same time. He was a child, and he was something else that didn't have a name yet. I've been telling you a story about a recording session, but I want to pull back for a second and talk about what this story is really about, because I think there are a few threads here worth following. The first one is about conviction without arrogance. Michael didn't storm into that control room. He didn't demand. He didn't make a scene. He raised his hand and said what he heard. When the adults told him he was wrong, he didn't back down, but he also didn't escalate. He just waited, with complete certainty but without aggression. That is a very rare combination. Most of us, when we're certain we're right and an authority figure tells us we're wrong, either cave or get defensive. Michael did neither. He just held the position calmly, patiently, without drama, and waited for the evidence to arrive. That's not stubbornness, that's confidence, and there's a lesson there that has nothing to do with music. The second thread is about the difference between knowing you can do something and knowing when it's wrong. A lot of performers, artists, athletes, professionals of all kinds, they know when they're performing well. They have a feel for when it's going right. But knowing when it's wrong, when something external has changed, when the conditions aren't what they should be, that's different. That requires a kind of precise internal standard, a reference point that stays fixed while everything else changes. Michael had that. His internal standard was so stable that even when the external conditions shifted by 3%, a tiny, nearly imperceptible drift, it registered against that fixed point like a blip on a radar screen. You can cultivate this. Not to Michael's degree, that was biological in ways most of us don't have access to. But you can work at developing a more precise internal model of what good looks like in your field. You can raise your standards for what you accept as good enough. You can calibrate your internal gauge more finely. Michael is an extreme case, but the principle is universal. The third thread is about how institutions respond to being challenged. The Motown engineers and producer did something that, frankly, a lot of institutions don't do. They checked. They could have dismissed the kid. They could have said, "We're running on a schedule, let's move on." Some rooms would have done exactly that. Instead, the producer said, "Fine, we'll check it." And that one decision, that willingness to entertain the possibility that a child might be right about something a professional had missed, led to finding a real problem, fixing it, and getting a better recording. More than that, it changed the relationship. The engineers didn't just fix the machine. They recalibrated their assumptions about Michael. They started treating him differently, not like a child star to be managed, but like a musician to be listened to. That kind of institutional responsiveness, the willingness to say, "Maybe I missed something, let's look," is genuinely rare and genuinely valuable, and the Motown team deserves credit for it. They could have been defensive. They weren't. They were professionals, and real professionals know that being right matters more than being the one who was right. Michael Jackson went on to become, by any measure, the most commercially successful solo artist in the history of recorded music. Thriller has sold an estimated 70 million copies worldwide. Billie Jean, Beat It, Thriller, Man in the Mirror, Black or White. These aren't just songs. They're part of the permanent sonic landscape of the world. People who have never in their lives voluntarily listened to pop music know Thriller. People on every continent, in countries whose languages have nothing to do with English, know the opening riff of Billie Jean. But what made those records isn't just charisma or talent or timing. It's precision. It's the kind of obsessive, almost frightening dedication to getting the sound right that started in a Detroit recording studio in 1970 when an 11-year-old raised his hand. Listen to Billie Jean, really listen to it. The bass line is sitting at exactly the right frequency. The drum pattern has that particular crack on the snare that makes you feel it in your chest before you consciously register the beat. The vocal performance is controlled right up to the point where it releases into pure feeling. Every element is where it is for a reason, placed with precision, calibrated against some internal standard. There's a famous story about Thriller. Quincy Jones wanted to shorten the song for radio play because 12-minute epics weren't exactly what radio programmers were looking for. Michael refused. He said the song needed to be the length it was. He was right. The song needed the full arc, the build-up, the Vincent Price monologue, the extended outro, to deliver what it delivered. And Michael knew it because his internal standard for that song was complete. He could hear what it was supposed to be, all the way to the end. That same certainty, that same willingness to hold the position while the adults in the room said, "That's not how this works." That same calm insistence on the thing being what it should be. It started with a tape machine running 3% too fast. I want to go back to one small detail, because I think it's one of the most human moments in this whole story. The assistant engineer, the young guy barely 20, the one who smirked when Michael said the machine was wrong, the one who caught himself smirking and put it away. That smirk is so recognizable. We've all felt that the instinct to dismiss something, to think we know better, to assume the system is correct and the person challenging it is wrong. He swallowed it, and when the truth came out, he was the one who pulled out the maintenance log and wrote something in the margin next to the last calibration entry. He was updating the record, making sure it was documented, processing what had just happened. Later that evening, when the session wrapped and Michael was sitting on a stool waiting for his father, the assistant engineer walked past him and stopped. "Hey," he said, that was really something." Michael looked up. "Thanks. How old are you?" 11. The assistant engineer stood there for a moment, doing the math in his head. Then he said, "See you tomorrow." "See you." That's it, that's the whole exchange. No grand statement, no dramatic declaration, just a young man who came into the room with a smirk and left it with something that looked like respect, who stopped to acknowledge what had happened because it deserved to be acknowledged. Sometimes that's all a moment needs. The producer kept those session notes for the rest of his life. When he talked about that day, and he did multiple times in different interviews over the years, he always came back to the same thing. Not the hit records, not the Thriller era, not the moonwalk, not the MTV videos that changed television, not the sold-out stadiums or the world tour or the fame that became its own kind of phenomenon. He came back to the tape machine, to the strobe disc, to the marks that blurred and then steadied, to an 11-year-old who said, "Check the speed," and stood there waiting while a room full of professionals caught up to what he already knew. "That's when I knew he'd be great," the producer said. "Not famous, great, because fame is timing and luck. Great is knowing the tape speed's wrong when nobody else in the room can hear it." There are a lot of ways to be a good musician. You can be technically brilliant. You can be emotionally compelling. You can be charismatic and magnetic and able to command a stage. You can have the voice, the moves, the look. Michael Jackson had all of those things. He had them more than almost anyone who has ever lived. But what that session revealed, what that one moment of a raised hand and 3 quiet words, "That's not my voice," revealed was something underneath all of those things. A commitment to the integrity of the sound itself. A refusal to let something be wrong just because the authority figures in the room said it was right. A certainty that was grounded not in arrogance or ego, but in the simple, unshakable knowledge of what the thing was supposed to sound like. That's the foundation. Everything else, the albums, the records, the transformation of popular music, the cultural force that Michael Jackson became, was built on that foundation. A kid who heard what no one else heard, and said so. So here's what I want you to take away from this. We tell the story of Michael Jackson as a story about stardom, about fame, about one of the most extraordinary pop careers in history, and that story is real and it's worth telling. But underneath that story is a smaller one, the one about a studio in Detroit in 1970, about a tape machine and a strobe disc and a legal pad with 2 circles on it. About a kid whose feet didn't touch the floor when he sat on the stool, who watched cartoons when he got home, who got in trouble with his brothers like any other kid, and who also happened to carry inside him a tuning fork so precise that it could detect a drift of 3% and knew, without being able to fully explain how, that what he was hearing wasn't what he had made. That's the thing about greatness. When you look closely enough at it, it's almost always doing something simple. Not easy, simple, caring about the sound, knowing what it's supposed to be, refusing to call it good when it isn't, waiting patiently for the room to catch up. Michael Jackson did that at 11. He did it at 21. He did it at 40. Every record, every session, every time he stood in front of a microphone, that same internal compass was running, checking the output against the standard, catching what others missed. We don't know exactly how many great recordings we almost didn't get because the tape machine was a little fast. But we know that, at least once, a kid caught it. And that made all the difference. If this video did something for you, if it made you hear Michael Jackson's music a little differently, or think about what it means to really hear something, please hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who'd enjoy it. And subscribe if you want more stories like this one. We're going to keep going deep on the moments that changed music, not just the hits, not just the famous names, but the sessions, the decisions, the small rooms where the big things actually happened. Drop a comment and let me know, what do you think it actually feels like to have absolute pitch, to walk through the world hearing it the way Michael heard it? I'm genuinely curious what you think. There's a playlist linked in the description, more deep dives into music history, more stories from behind the glass. Go check it out. Thanks for watching, and the next time you hear Billie Jean, really listen to it. Someone worked very, very hard to make every single element sit exactly right. You'll hear it differently now,